Uh, Greetings, everyone. I am happy to welcome all of our guests and viewers. I would like to start apologizing to our viewers for the mistake regarding the scheduling of the event, especially to the viewers in Canada and the United States. The UK changes the clock on last Sunday, October, and US changes the clock on the first Sunday of November. So it was not reflected in our promotional materials, unfortunately, and I apologize for that. In any case, I'm grateful for everyone who joined. I am Andrzej Smitsnuk, Senior Teacher Associate at the Faculty of Modern Medieval Languages and Linguistics here at the University of Cambridge, where I teach Ukrainian language, and I am happy to welcome you to the Cambridge Ukrainian Studies webinar. Today's speaker is Dr. Emily Channell-Justice. She's the director of the Temerty Contemporary Ukraine Program at the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. This is a program which I personally follow and admire, as its events, both online and in person, explore Ukraine from so many different perspectives: linguistic, political, historical, economic, and Emily studies Ukraine from a perspective of sociocultural anthropology. Her book, which we'll talk today, the Without the State, Self-Organization and Political Activism, was published last year by the University of Toronto Press and won the most recent 2023 American Association of Ukrainian Studies Book Award. It explores Euromaidan in 2013-2014, specifically through ethnographic research with leftist, feminists, and student activists in Kyiv. And according to Emily, this is the key contribution of this book is about self-organization. So when people have the ability to do something and that thing needs to be done, so they just simply do it. It reminds a lot about 2022 in many ways too. And this virtual event will take the form of approximately 40-minute long lecture, and then it will be followed by a Q&A session. I would really ask to our viewers to submit your questions in written form through Q&A feature on Zoom at any moment during or after the interview. And again, thanks so much for coming. And Emily, thank you so much for joining us. The floor is yours now.
Thank you, Andrzej. Thank you so much for such a nice introduction. And thank you to the Cambridge Ukrainian Studies program for the invitation. I would also love to add that this book is the co-winner of the American Association of Ukrainian Studies Prize with Roy Finnan's Blood of Others. And I think, more than anything, that just highlights how exceptional scholarship in Ukrainian studies is at this moment. And so it's really a pleasure to be in the same discussion as so many important contributors to that discussion. So let me get started with the discussion of the book. As Andrzej mentioned, so I'm here to talk about my book, Without the State, which of course is a book that I wrote far before the full-scale invasion happened, but somehow has taken on a lot of new relevant meaning since February of 2022. So I completed the research for this book really between 2012 and 2021, with the bulk of the research taking place in 2013 and 2014 during the Euromaidan protests. Most of that research I did in Kyiv. And so all the photos that you'll see in this presentation are photos that I took while I was doing this fieldwork. And so not only are we talking about a lot of these themes about self-organization newly in light of the full-scale invasion, but of course we're going on the 10-year anniversary of the Euromaidan protests. And so that's also prompting a lot of reflection, thinking about what did we learn from these protests, and especially how does what we learned during these protests change how we think about the full-scale invasion and the Ukrainian response to the full-scale invasion. So this book and this presentation today is framed around the two key concepts of the book. The first one is self-organization, which Andrei very succinctly summarized. And the second concept is the state. And I take an ethnographic anthropological view of the state, which I'll kind of talk about what I mean by that. And I think, just as I talk about in this book, those things being reframed during these Euromaidan protests, these things are also being reframed now in response to the invasion. And I want to pull out a quote from President Zelensky from one of his national addresses in March of 2022, when he stated, "Today, everyone is bringing glory to Ukraine in their own way. Na своєму місці. It shows the world who Ukrainians are and what power we have." And I find this statement to be very much a version of self-organization. It's a statement made by a head of state, and that head of state is relying on the effectiveness of self-organized citizens in order to fight for Ukraine's right to exist. The citizen response to the full-scale invasion has ranged from people who are volunteering for the armed forces of Ukraine, or they're volunteering in support roles to aid the armed forces, they're helping displaced people, they're delivering aid to the front lines, or they're raising money to support any of these kinds of initiatives. This collective response across the territory of Ukraine defied all expectations, even for people like me who always said, well, if there's an invasion, Ukrainians will resist. But the kind of scale of this resistance, I think, has been even greater than I could have anticipated. So how is this response kind of grounded in history of self-organization, and specifically how self-organization has played out since Ukraine's independence? A little bit about how I get here in my research. So I started working in 2012 in Ukraine with an independent student union called Temerty. This was an organization that was active at a variety of university campuses throughout the 2000s, mostly in Kiev, but all over Ukraine. So these are leftist affiliated activists, this very broadly defined idea of the left. They're not associated with the communist or socialist parties of Ukraine. And generally speaking, they weren't associated with political parties at all. Many of them had very diverse viewpoints on what it meant to be part of the left in Ukraine. For some of them, it was a criticism of the presence of the far right and of nationalist perspectives. It also tended to encompass people who were feminists or who were fighting for LGBT equality. Those two types of activism were also very much in contrast or as a counterpoint to far-right activism. And then others were student activists who, through student activism, gained an interest in advocating for things like equitable access to institutions, high-quality access to high-quality healthcare, education, for example. But even as I kind of formulated this project, this is a very marginal political voice in the 2010s. But they're also a post-independence left. So they come to these leftist ideas, broadly defined, with Ukraine being an independent country. They grow up post-1991. So they're influenced by other experiences of political activism. And notably, many of them point to the 2004 Orange Revolution as a key moment in terms of their politicization, how they realize how they want to be active in political society. But that's also a key moment where they become critical of typical political activism and typical kinds of political institutions. And so what most of them are kind of united in advocating for is a left that is part of a broadly democratic Ukrainian society in which political pluralism is the norm. So I started doing ethnographic research with these activists. This photo was taken in 2012 at a student organizing camp in Crimea, the one time I had a chance to go. And this was really about building an experience of solidarity, but also to learn about protest tactics and specifically about self-organization. So when we're talking about self-organization, what are we talking about? As Andrei exactly quoted, when something needs to be done and someone can do it, then they should simply do it. It's a really basic idea. But the way that the activists that I was working with conceptualized this term, it's very disconnected from political participation in existing political structures and specifically within existing political parties. And so it exists in many ways kind of outside this entity that we think about as the state, which again, I'll talk about in the next part. So it opens up the space for political participation that criticizes the consolidation of power in the hands of the state, and thus that consolidation limits what it means to be a political activist. It limits how people can be political. And self-organization shows us that actually you can be political in lots of different ways, as long as you are, kind of thinking about what needs to be done, and advocating to others about how to help one another do those things. So when I talk about self-organization in my book, I look at how it becomes increasingly effective in the 2013-2014 Euromaidan protests, because they become attached from existing political parties. And then we see how self-organization becomes the driving force behind the protest as a whole, and becomes very much detached from any kind of political ideology, whether that be left or right. Anybody can be self-organized. It just depends on how you're doing the organizing. But because of the way that self-organization during Maidan related and criticized the state, it also became a new way for Ukrainian citizens to identify with political participation. And what I end up talking about as the book goes on and moves past the Euromaidan protests, it becomes a primary way for people to respond to the first invasion in 2014 as well. So when I'm talking about this idea of the state, what am I talking about? Basically, looking specifically at actors and institutions that have the governing power within a territory. And this is, to me, a helpful way of looking at what we mean by the state, because the actors and institutions that make up that idea of the state can change over time. So what that means is that in this case, in this photo, which is a picture from obviously the Yanukovych era, this is a guy who's kind of mocking Yanukovych. The state led by Yanukovych doesn't represent citizens of Ukraine, because Yanukovych is acting on behalf of his own interests, not on behalf of the citizens who he purportedly represents. And so the criticism of the state and the working outside of the state in this case is because of the fact that the state institutions are not representative of citizens. But of course, the actual power that those bodies have can change over time as well, depending on economic, political, social factors. In the Yanukovych era state, we see not only a consolidation of political power, but also economic power. We see a consolidation around a small group of people who then, their political position drives a Ukraine that doesn't actually reflect what the majority of people see as the future of Ukraine. And so the last point, that people who live in a territory and how they relate to their state, how they relate is not a fixed thing, is really key in how we understand the state. Because of course, in 2013, and when I start my fieldwork in 2012, Yanukovych is the person who represents this idea of the state. People are critical of Yanukovych because he doesn't represent a lot of people's beliefs. He's not working on behalf of Ukraine. But later on, when we get new political leaders, that allows people to change their relationship with the state, which again is something that I will get into as we move along. But I think that tells us, that when we talk about this state entity, it's not something fixed. It's very changeable. How we relate to it as citizens is changeable. And what I argue is that the Euromaidan protests are key in shifting that relationship between the citizens and the state. So why are leftist activists so involved in the Euromaidan protests? In the years leading up to these protests, leftist activists are tracing this idea of self-organization to broader socialist ideas of self-help. They very much position their activism within global anti-capitalist movements such as Occupy Wall Street. And they want to be part of this global left criticism of kind of the consolidation of wealth and power in the hands of very few people. Their main entrance into the Euromaidan protest, certainly because they understood that this was a very significant historic moment. At the same time, many of them started out by kind of criticizing the notion of Ukraine's European future, not because they wanted Ukraine to have a future that was more connected with Russia, right? This isn't about some kind of rejuvenated Soviet Ukraine. But the notion that when Ukraine becomes part of the EU, it will actually be at the bottom of an economic hierarchy, that the EU is just like any other capitalist entity in terms of how the EU has accumulated wealth and power in the hands of very few people. These leftist activists were asking questions like, how does this benefit the everyday person in Ukraine if Ukraine becomes part of the EU. And they really position themselves as asking questions, wanting to get people who were protesting to think about what they meant when they said Ukraine is part of Europe, Ukraine has a European future, and they really wanted to think about supporting a Ukraine in a Europe that is not economically marginal. So, as of course you, I'm sure, all remember or have thought about again lately, because we're, in our 10-year kind of reflection period, the Euromaidan protests initially are very much about this question of Europe and about Ukraine's European future. President Yanukovych is supposed to sign the association agreement with the EU in November of 2013. At the last minute, he decides he's not going to do that. Ukraine is supposed to go into the customs union with the Russian Federation, this Eurasian customs union. And so this provokes people to come out and protest in the square here. And you can see this is after the first clearing of the square. You can see the Christmas tree in the background, which is allegedly the reason that people were no longer allowed to protest or camp there. But of course, what happens is that after this violence is used against peaceful protesters who are supporting Ukraine's European future, the protests more broadly become about the state itself. The fact that the heads of state do not represent Ukrainians, are willing to use violence against them. And that is what kind of culminates the protest into being this much larger protest camp occupation around the city of Kyiv. Thanks to a lot of other excellent research, we know that there's similar protests all across Ukraine in pretty much every major city of Ukraine. And this is something that shows, and at the same time, that many people from other cities also come to Kyiv to participate in the protests. So this is something that becomes about much, much more than Europe itself. And what I think is especially interesting about this shift, and that really highlights the important role of leftist activists, is that as in the beginning, leftists are very critical of this Ukraine should be part of Europe focus. They have criticisms of the EU. They want people to think about that. But once these violent state actors get involved, leftist activists shift the language of the protest to be critical of the state, but specifically of the police state and of the violence being used by state actors. And this is something that was especially interesting to witness because the activists I was working with were very intentional. In the first few weeks of the protest, they often experienced violence at the hands of other protesters who did not want to see, introduction of notions of feminism, or they didn't want to see criticisms of Europe. But once we start having this police violence idea, it's very detached from any specifically leftist language or specifically leftist political activism. And so it becomes something that resonates with a lot of protesters. And that's something we see with this banner, "We are against a police state," which is hanging outside of the Kyiv City Hall, which of course was one of the central occupied buildings that supported protesters. This was occupied in the very beginning of December and remained occupied throughout the next several months. And this banner was actually created by leftist activists. It was originally hung outside of the city hall off of a lamppost. And it moved, at some point took it off of that lamppost and moved it into the inside of this occupied city hall. And then again, later, somebody moved it to the outside of the city hall. And I think that this is so emblematic of how leftists were really strategic about their participation. I can pretty much guarantee you that the people who brought it into this occupied building had no idea where this banner came from. But the language resonated so deeply because protesters at this point were all talking about the police state. And that is really what they were fighting against. So, as I've said, self-organization, it's a very flexible, fluid idea. Leftists introduce it on Maidan in particular as having this very anti-state, kind of state-critical positioning. They use the language of the state as part of that criticism. This is what resonates more broadly with the protesters, other than not something that's specific to political ideology. But what is especially interesting to me is how this language of self-organization gets picked up and moves beyond this protest space. Certainly I mentioned that self-organization became a term that a lot of different political actors used. So we even saw people who were part of, for example, far-right organizations call their organizations self-organized. And what they meant by that was it exists outside of the state led by Yanukovych, the state that we are saying doesn't represent us. So self-organization also became a kind of shorthand to mean not part of the state. But what also I think is especially interesting is how self-organization kind of moves beyond this overtly political situation. And this is what happens after Russia first invades Crimea in February of 2014. So when we're talking about the state in 2012 and 2013, we're talking about a state that does not meet people's needs because its actors have their own self-interest in mind. However, February 2014, Yanukovych is ousted, we get an interim government, and that sort of is part of what prompts the first invasion, starting in Crimea and then later in Eastern Ukraine. And so the state as a kind of institution or body of institutions and actors is different at this point. Yanukovych is no longer the head, but the state is still unable to meet the people's needs in terms of its ability to protect them from this invasion entirely. And that's not because state actors don't want to meet people's needs, it's because they can't. It's because the state doesn't have the capacity to, first of all, respond strongly enough to the invasion of Crimea, second of all, respond to the invasion and uprisings in Eastern Ukraine, and then third of all, to deal with the massive amounts of displacement, which is what is that's my ongoing research project now, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. But what we find here is that self-organization becomes really detached from its political goals because it's not exactly criticizing the state because the state is unable to meet people's needs. At the same time, it's also serving the state. It's filling a gap that the state has left by its inability to meet the needs of people for things that officially are the jurisdiction of the state. So to some extent, this encourages people to find really specific and localized ways to enact self-organization. So for instance, we saw a lot of, in the wake of the first invasion and displacement, we saw a lot of organization of people in small or in any cities doing hotlines that helped people find places to resettle temporarily. And this is something that I think shows us it's not a specifically or overtly political type of action. And people who I know who were very, very far from political activists were very involved in for example, my Ukrainian tutor from Lviv, when Crimea was invaded and people were trying to come to mainland Ukraine, worked on this hotline to help Crimean families resettle. She's someone who never would have considered herself political, but because there was this gap, which is that people need help finding a place to stay, she is a person who can help use her networks in the local community to find a place for them to stay, and that is something that is meeting a specific need and therefore self-organized. She is not explicitly criticizing the fact that the state is responsible for internally displaced people, but at the same time, she's doing something that otherwise would be impossible to do without the help of ordinary people. So what this ends up turning into, and what this is something that we see not only in, observed in my ethnographic research, but if we look at other kinds of research like larger scale surveys or sociological research, instead of, so typically what we have evidence of is that Ukrainians have a very low level of trust in the state as a whole. And the thing that becomes really interesting in the wake of 2014 is not that people start to trust the state, but that they actually start to trust volunteers. They start to trust groups that are doing self-organized things that are actually meeting people's needs through self-organization. Not because that's not their job, right? That's not their official position, but this trust goes to those people because they have shown that they can do the thing they're supposed to do. And so what's interesting is not there's not a growth in trust of the state, but there is a growth in trust elsewhere. And so that also, I think, encourages this self-organized action to continue because it's effective, people trust it, people know that they can go to self-organized initiatives to find help to get their needs met. And this is something that became kind of complex and makes more complex the whole idea of self-organization. And I'll tell just one story from my own research that shows how the activists that I worked with had a kind of complex relationship with this as well. I'll call this activist Vitaly. He's a leftist and student activist who became a combat medic in the wake of the first invasion around 2015. So he had volunteered in 2015 with a very special rapid response emergency medical unit and deployed to the ATO zone in Eastern Ukraine. And he spoke about this on Facebook. Because he was so central in a lot of activist conversations, it generated a lot of discussion about this type of self-organization. Because of course, he positions this activism, this volunteering as a kind of self-organization. He specifically mentioned that the medical brigade he was working with is not officially affiliated with the Ukrainian armed forces. He wasn't serving private security. He simply went because he was an activist. He related it to his experiences of Euromaidan, to self-organization. Basically, he felt that if there's not enough medics and he is certified as a combat medic, if he doesn't volunteer, people will die. And again, a self-organized initiative, something needs to be done, and he's going to do it. On the one hand, we can sort of see this as a criticism of state institutions. The Ukrainian armed forces at this time is not strong enough to save people's lives. That's a huge problem. On the other hand, and this was the criticism of a lot of other leftist activists to this particular person's willingness to volunteer, they basically criticized that he was serving the state, that his activism to serve in the volunteer brigades is allowing the state to not do what it's supposed to do, to not reform the military, and you're basically letting them off the hook for not doing their jobs. And this is something actually so interesting to see this resonate with other writers. Alessia Khrovechuk has written about this as well, with very specific conversations where people are saying basically the same exact thing. And so while I talk about it specifically from the leftist activist group position, I think this is a problem that resonated with a lot of people. How do you force the state to actually, reform the armed forces, which is what it's supposed to do, if you are going to fill the gaps left by that all the time? Again, I think this question can be seen in a new light in the wake of the full-scale invasion, but we'll get into that later. So I think this sort of glossing of terms over the past 10 years, where self-organization and volunteer work and humanitarian work all kind of come under the same framework of activism outside of the state that isn't inherently political, but can serve as a very effective criticism of the state. It's come in a lot of forms. So it's come in this form of these volunteer medical brigades, like I mentioned. It's come in the form of volunteers who are sourcing sourcing equipment for the brigades, for the volunteer brigades. And it's also something that has been very well documented in terms of the volunteer response to forced displacement of Ukrainian citizens from the temporarily occupied territories. So this is something that I have been looking at in my current research project, which specifically I've been talking to people who were basically organizing a totally self-organized response when displacement was first starting after the first invasion. And a lot of them say very similar things. This is the job of the Ukrainian government. They're not doing anything. We're not going to just leave people to, be behind. We can actually help them very easily, gathering communities together, finding people temporary places to stay. And so again, we see this shift in how people are relating to the state. So it's not the same. In 2014 or 2013, Yanukovych government, the actors that make up the state have no legitimacy because they don't have people's best interests in mind. But in 2014, we see that the state does not have the capacity to meet people's needs, even though it probably does have people's best interests in mind. And so that's where we get this expanded space for trust in volunteer-based initiatives, because state actors can't fill those needs. And so that's where you get this tension between, non-state actors, volunteer-based actors who become trustworthy because they're so effective, but they also don't force the state actors to take responsibility for example, large-scale displacement. And so that's kind of the state that we find ourselves in after the full-scale invasion in 2022. I should add also, the war is obviously ongoing. There's very long conversations about what kind of volunteering is appropriate. Leftists in this time period are focusing on criticizing certain higher education reforms in the kind of post-Maidan Europeanization of higher education. Many activists are also focused on workers' rights and changes in the labor code. What I discovered was that a lot of activists after Maidan were really just burnt out by this huge large-scale mobilization and decided that they wanted to kind of refocus on particular initiatives, which I think is also a very interesting choice that people decided to make. And so that's kind of the landscape of what's happening when Russia invades again in February 2022. So like I mentioned, for me and for a lot of us who have been paying attention to this sort of self-organization and the growth of volunteering in Ukraine, it wasn't surprising to see the Ukrainian response, but at the same time, it was also shocking to see the scale of what people were willing to do. So people who had previously volunteered following the previous invasion, like my friend Vitaly, who was the combat medic, that's his pack on the far left there. So he re-enlisted. He's been fighting. He's been deployed a couple of times in the past year and a half. Most of the people that I know who were involved in my project did stay in Ukraine. If they were there, they have almost all stayed. And most of them have been organizing humanitarian aid, specifically delivering medical needs. The person in the central photo is delivering medicine to frontline community. And they are also in the initial days of the invasion and in the first 2 months, the sort of leftist social network groups that I'm in were, organizing ride shares. Who needs to get a ride from one point to another? Does anybody know what to do when we cross the border to Poland, or how do we get back, or where can we stay? There was a lot of coordination on that level as well, and I think it's these very ordinary people responding to a totally extraordinary circumstance to help one another. That's, even if it's small scale, it's still in the same vein of the spirit of the Euromaidan protest. And I think also, people have really picked up on the effectiveness of self-organization as a response to what's happening. Obviously, in 2014, people understood that political self-organization could be very effective in removing a political leader. But now this use of self-organization in the response to the full-scale invasion has also, it's prompted even additional responses. And so my friend Ivan Shmatko, who's actually featured in that central photo, he wrote a great piece for the Ukrainian Research Institute's website. And I really like his framing. So I'm going to quote a couple of pieces of his article just to kind of highlight how he's talking about the response of people, that's this kind of self-organized response. So he says, quote, "While the armed forces were largely preoccupied with the war itself, millions of Ukrainians fled their homes. At the same time, more than 100,000 people rushed to sign up for the Territorial Defense Forces, a network of local volunteer units that were created to help the army protect cities and villages. Those volunteers were often supplied with nothing more than automatic rifles. Thousands of Ukrainians helped organize to help internally displaced persons with food, transportation, and housing. And they also supplied the Territorial Defense Forces with bulletproof vests, medical kits, and clothing. To do all of this, volunteers relied almost exclusively on informal networks and not on state institutions." On the one hand, again, this is very reminiscent of the type of volunteering that was done in 2014. One of the, I think, most important critiques of this framework comes from Elizabeth Dunn, who's an anthropologist who's worked extensively on humanitarian response to displacement. And she's written about how these new volunteer networks are very dispersed. So typical humanitarian aid response and aid distribution networks come in these very centralized, delivery of aid that's it comes from a very top-down initiative. But what we're seeing in Ukraine right now is these much more dispersed roles. People can take on much more diverse roles, and this can make aid distribution especially effective. I mean, for instance, these two friends who have been fighting as part of the territorial defense unit, right? They regularly run fundraisers for very specific things that they need, and so there's no waste, there's no overhead costs, and that's very effective. But on the other hand, the problem that these types of networks rely on ordinary people who have ordinary lives, who are just trying to survive this totally, unexpected and horrific experience of war, that usage and reliance on the energy of volunteers is really problematic for a kind of sustainable response, for a sustainable self-organized response. Because as long as the need is there, people will be responsible for meeting it. And so Ivan, later in this piece, he wrote a really effective reflection, I think, that I found really moving, that I'd like to quote again. He says, "Certainly as a volunteer, you know that you cannot save everyone. You also know that your emotional resources are limited in the face of the stream of suffering that seems endless. You simply can't fundraise enough to provide everyone with a bulletproof vest, a tourniquet, or night vision. That means that someone will die. Someone who would have lived had you fundraised an extra $600. But this is an endless process. If you had done that, then you would feel that another $600 were achievable, and then another, and then another." I think that self-organization in this time of war kind of subsumes individuality. It goes beyond each individual person doing what they can, and it kind of encompasses a whole society of people who are all serving in whatever way they can. It's part of the impulse that's justifying Ukraine's very existence right now. And so just to come back to the original idea about how people relate to the state, I think this is showing us another new way that people are relating to the actors and institutions that make up the state. So previously, I argued that self-organization allowed governments and political figures to exploit people's willingness to volunteer their time and expertise. Now I feel like the self-organization, at least up until now, kind of serves this new idea of the state. So our current state, of course, we're talking about the state represented by President Zelensky, and that state, those state actors are working to do their part to fight for the right of Ukraine to exist. So when people who are not part of those state institutions are doing their own self-organization, we're sort of seeing kind of combined fight. Everybody is doing what they can. Zelensky is advocating for more weapons, wherever he can, to protect the people here who are delivering aid to the front lines or who are fighting to regain territory in Eastern Ukraine. So everybody's fighting for the same thing. And so this existence of Ukraine is fighting against the Imperial Russian power that is denying Ukraine's own self-determination. And so all this self-organization serves the state in some way. And I'm very curious to see what happens in terms of how, following the Ukrainian victory, how are Ukrainians going to relate to the new state after that? But for now, what's I think most effective and most interesting is looking at how all of this self-organization is contributing to making sure that Ukraine survives. Thank you so much for listening, and happy to talk more about any aspect of what I brought up today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I especially appreciate the photos because they have a sense of reality. These are real photos, but taken by real people. I do appreciate it a lot, and especially also the part about how it resonates with 2022. I would like to encourage our viewers to submit your questions using the Q&A feature, or if that is if you have any difficulties with that, over the chat. But I would like to start with my own question, or I don't know, one half questions, if I can say so. You primarily focus on the left, on political left in Ukraine. And I think you touched a little bit in the book, why is that? And for me, I think that I started, during the Euromaidan, I started watching Russian news for the first time in my entire life, just to see how it is seen in Russia. and according to the Russian news, it was all just Ukrainian right. And I would just like to know what role do you think this Ukrainian right played in Euromaidan, and also I think just so we're clear, do you define them the same way as you would do in the United States, or do you think Ukrainian right, left are slightly different as categories overall?
Yeah, so I originally in my research was hoping to work with student organizations of variety of political backgrounds. Once the Euromaidan started, and especially once I saw some violence against left-wing activists during those protests, I had the realization, ethnographically, I would be putting people at risk if I tried to also make contact with people on the right. And, to be totally honest, I do to some extent feel like there's an over attention to the far right in Ukraine, and that's partly because of specifically what you've mentioned, these Russian narratives that tend to be really effective. So I didn't want to contribute to that. I wanted to tell a different story. So like I said, this left is a very broad group of people. There's no one single leftist viewpoint, which is both good and bad, right? It means that the left is a very robust discussion of what it means to be left, but it also means that there's very little, institutional political power for the left, although I think there's also disagreement about whether that would be a good idea anyway, but that's part of the last chapter of the book. So in terms of the far right, this was something I witnessed a lot of, so something that was really interesting as a kind of research over time sort of question, because I did witness people who were clearly part of far right organizations on Maidan, lots of far right symbology, things that I'm critical of in the book that, seem to be presented as something that should represent all of Ukraine, but that were very, that actually weren't representing all of Ukraine. And just as one example, there was often different kinds of images of Stepan Bandera as a national hero on Maidan, right? That's something that we know there's tons of historical debates. It's a very political part of history. Stepan Bandera does not represent all Ukrainians, and certainly not all Ukrainians on Maidan. So at the same time, I think it sort of exaggerated the actual amount of power that those people had. Just if we're looking at like this notion of the police state as language that got mobilized, that's a very left-wing framework that came to resonate with people of all kinds of political perspectives because of the detachment from political ideology. Whereas far-right organizations were more largely focused on these kind of very far-right specific kind of political positions. So you can't really detach them, from their positions. So I think they have a different presence, possibly a more vocal presence, a presence that was clearly very easy to pick up on if you are wanting to present a certain narrative. When I got back to the US after this fieldwork, people were always asking me, it was like a far right takeover, right? And I had to tell them I worked with radical leftists and feminists, so no, that they were there too. So and of course that's been a big debate in terms of the scholarly discussion, is what actual power does the far right have in Ukraine? They do not have institutional political power either, right? They're not people who are getting elected. And for the most part, actually, I think now we're seeing very few of them having big platforms. So, on the one hand, I don't want to just say this is like an intentional Russian narrative to discredit the Euromaidan. But on the other hand, 10 years later, I do actually view these protests as far more politically pluralistic than I did when I was witnessing them to some extent, because I think the effects and the way that it's empowered people to be political actors is very broad in terms of the political spectrum. So I also, I'm grateful to the people who have done research to talk to people in far right groups so that, we can learn about that perspective without having to always include that in my own research. I think it's kind of a group effort that we all have to help one another out to understand the whole landscape of politics in Ukraine. And just I forgot that you had mentioned, does it look like the far right in the US? I don't think so. I mean, I think it's a very, I think I'm an anthropologist, so I like to look for a specific context of how we get to where we are. And the generation of far right actors in Ukraine in the post-independence period is very different than the generation of the far right really anywhere else, even if they do have some sort of shared ideologies.
Okay, thank you so much. And we have our first question, which is very, very emotional. It's from Maria Proshkovska. I was just crying during the presentation. It took me back to these events and my participation in it. Thank you for your amazing presentation. Do you think Ukrainian activism and feminism has a special chance to develop because of our extreme situation and past current conditions?
Thank you, Maria, for those kind words. That means so much to me. And I do. I mean, I know it's difficult to be optimistic in this moment. Things are very challenging, not just in Ukraine, but around the world right now. But I think what's so interesting about Ukrainian activism is, and this includes feminism too, is this sort of unwillingness to be silent in the wake of, we should wait because something else is more important. That, to me, that I write about this in terms of feminism, I found that to be a very kind of complex thing that was happening with feminist activism. It's always this negotiation. Is the national question, do we have to solve this question of national identity first, and only then we can talk about women and gender equality, or can we solve these two things together? And I found it so remarkable that feminists on Maidan were saying, we need to talk about women's equality and gender equality right now as part of this. And I think that is very particular to, maybe not exclusive to the Ukrainian case, but it's something that is remarkable about these protests and the number and kinds of people who were participating and who were fighting for the thing that they felt was most important, even if that's not what everybody wanted to hear. And I mean, how effective were these protests? They not only did they oust the president and cause a lot, or at least open the door to a lot more reform than we would have thought was possible, even a couple of years after the protest. Looking back on Euromaidan 10 years later, I see them as so much more important than I even thought they were a couple of years afterward. And I think that's really phenomenal. But it's also, I really do think that it's because people who were activists during these protests figured out another way to be really active participants in political society. And that means that Ukraine has this really, really, really engaged political society. That's why when Russia invades and says, Kiev will fall in 3 days, that's not what happens, because everybody is ready to be involved in something, in fighting for something that matters to them. So in that sense, I do hope Ukraine and activism, does have a kind of special situation, like making the most of a bad situation, but also like using the platform. Activists in Ukraine are using the platform that they have now to make sure people understand what Ukraine is. And I think that's just so remarkable that people are able to do that. So my kind of general optimistic answer is yes, I do think there's a special chance.
Thank you. That's very good to hear. And another question from anonymous attendee. What are your perception of the increasing sentiment that self-organization at the start of the invasion was compensating for weaknesses and gaps of the state, but in the second year of the war, we could expect that there will be no such necessity for volunteers gathering money for army, etc., and people are becoming dissatisfied with the state effort?
Yeah, I think it's a super important question. And I mean, I don't want to say it's totally inevitable, but I mean, that's kind of why I brought in this position at the end of the presentation, that it's very difficult for volunteers to sustain this for such a long time. I mean, when we're talking about the Euromaidan protests, really we're talking about a 7-month occupation of the city center, but really we're talking about a couple of months of major activism. And already with this full-scale invasion, I mean, we're talking about more than a year and a half. That's really challenging. I think it's inevitable that some criticism will be targeted at President Zelensky, even at the same time that I think people understand that it isn't entirely up to him. I mean, he cannot control elections in Slovakia or the United States, right? U.S. changing its opinion or position on Ukraine is, he has no control over that. And so, I do think there are very fair criticisms being leveled at the Zelensky government for things, that they can certainly do better or could have done better. And I am fearful that people's energy will run short. That is and money, right? I mean, we can't all keep donating all the time. That's exactly what Ivan was talking about in his piece. So, and I also, of course, in the context of the past couple of weeks, I mean, the world's attention span is so short. It's so easy for people to turn their attention to something else. And I am, again, very fearful that Ukraine will continue to kind of fall from the headlines, even as the war is not at all over. I don't know how to fix that problem. That's something you just sort of have to hope that people are able to find it in themselves to kind of keep going. I've been working with, advocacy groups in the U.S. to continue to lobby our Congress people to ask them to keep supporting Ukraine. That's something that, we can keep doing from here. But I think this is something to be expected at this point in the war, as it's gone on for so long. It's less optimistic. Sorry for the first optimistic answer, than having to kind of jump into a less optimistic position. But I think this is a really important reality.
Thank you. And third question from John Barnes. Do you have a perspective on why the Ukrainian government is enacting Resolution 953 from 5th of September 2023, and what its effect might be? So for me, I think it's the resolution that regulates humanitarian aid that is being sent to Ukraine, and it regulates the borders, but I don't know the details. And the question from John Barnes continues: as far as I understand, they are enacting this resolution to cut down on smuggling, but in practice, the new regulations require all organizations to register electronically and then full electronic documentation of all aid sent. For example, a price, weight, numbers of each type of item sent. Much UK aid goes through to small self-organizing groups on an informal and infrequent basis rather than large organizations. Will this affect the effective sending and distribution of aid when it comes into force on the 5th December 2023?
Yeah, Andrea, I hope that you're right about that, because I don't know exactly that number. But general answer is this seems like it's likely to be problematic. Some of what I'm hearing from people who have been doing a lot of humanitarian aid distribution and delivery, first of all, that it's very difficult for them to work with big international organizations because of the need to follow bureaucratic procedures that are not really very helpful. That's something, again, that was sort of not totally being avoided, but just wasn't the primary way of interacting around aid because of this reliance on self-organized networks. And so the Ukrainian side forcing people to work in that more bureaucratic way, I don't think is a great development. At the same time, I understand the motivation. I mean, one of the big things that people are talking about in the US, and I'm not totally sure if this is part of the rhetoric in the UK, but one of the big Republican talking points is that the US is giving Ukraine a blank check and there's no oversight on what they're doing with US aid, which is totally not true. But I understand that the Ukrainian government representatives are in this sort of overly cautious position of wanting to make sure they can prove that things are being used appropriately. But it goes very much against why the self-organized networks of aid have been so effective. Once you start having to provide receipts and count things and say, this is what we use this money for, you lose the flexibility of saying, well, we raised this money for this, but then what we actually needed was this, or we raised this money for this, but we couldn't get that thing, so we got this thing instead, and that's also good, right? That's part of why these networks are really working. And like, people who are working with communities, just for example, I'm thinking about people who have been working with hospitals. A hospital doesn't always know what it needs a month from now, right? It knows what we need right now. So they can't plan and ask for something too far ahead of time because they don't know what they're going to need or what they're going to run out of. So I think this is I understand the motivation, but I also think it's quite frustrating. I do also understand that there's been a lot of, how can I put it in the appropriate way? People who could be enforcing what we might call smuggling or otherwise illegal transportation of goods have been looking the other way a lot to help things get where they need to go. And we might end up cracking down on that practice too. From the people I spoke to, this was very helpful for them to get things into the country that needed to get into the country that were not totally legal to usually bring in. It's, again, something that doesn't totally surprise me that this far, into the response, there is a kind of interest in making things more official, especially as so much scrutiny comes on the amount of aid that Ukraine has received. But I am very concerned that it doesn't understand how effective these networks have been and how much these kind of self-organized networks have made up the foundation of effective aid distribution. It doesn't seem great to me, but I get it. I understand it.
Okay, thank you so much. We have a next question from Natalia Shulyakova. Thank you for your presentation. Do you think civil society will remain at least partly as mobilized as it was on the start of the invasion? What will take for it to happen? Who will be a respected party to call for the continuity of political activism when the post-war reconstruction in different sectors will start?
That's an important question too. From my observations just of student activism, because I paid attention to the trajectory of higher education activism for so much longer, when I started the research in 2012, it was a very, very active group of people really engaged in Maidan. When I went back in 2016 and 2017, it was on this absolute downhill slope. And then 2018, 2019, 2020 kind of goes back up, and then COVID happens, goes back down, right? And I really saw these kind of waves of activism. And I want to add too that the Femedia, the organization that I was originally working with, has rejuvenated itself and has a new Telegram channel and has a new Instagram since the war, since the invasion started. So I'm so impressed with that. So I think what is probably most likely, so let's say Ukraine victory tomorrow, there's got to be some time to drop off for people to, recharge and rest from having been sustaining the existence of Ukraine for the past year and a half. But people have also taken such a strong position that the reason that you should support Ukraine is because we are building this kind of Ukraine that we want to see. And people are so invested in being part of the post-war Ukraine, the post-war democracy that Ukraine is going to be, that I do think people will remain engaged because they want to be part of that. So I really, I think there will likely be, more like I don't know. I think it would be important for whoever are the actors that make up the state in this post-war period do need to sort of renegotiate their relationship with civil society actors, partly because the state needs to look different and partly because everybody, maybe not everybody, but vast majority of people have had some kind of engagement as volunteers at some point following the invasion. So we have, I think, an expansion of people's political engagement, and therefore there needs to be some kind of chance for people to reestablish what that engagement will look for ordinary citizens in peacetime. And so I do think the post-victory state needs to think about how to listen to civil society actors and advocates, how to have volunteers who have all this experience and kind of take into consideration what they see as the future state. When we're talking about reconstruction, we're talking about not just physical reconstruction, but also the reconstruction of political institutions that have been under martial law for this whole time. Again, understandable, but something that needs to be rethought when that law is listed. What is the forms democracy is going to take? And I really hope that there's a kind of robust non-government sector that's kind of holding accountable for the state actors to make sure that reforms that they're asking for do come through. Again, I do feel optimistic about that, because I think people are thinking about that question that you're asking now. It's not like, oh, we'll deal with, we'll figure out later on how we want it. No, people are already thinking like, okay, what do we want Ukraine to look like in the next 10 years? So I do think people will remain engaged, but I also think there needs to be some sort of time to kind of rest and recharge.
Okay, thank you so much. And then another question from Rory Finnan. Dear Emily, thank you so much for an outstanding presentation. You write so sensitively in your book about the challenges faced by grassroots leftists in Ukraine, who consistently had to present themselves as distinct, divergent from the Soviet ideological past and contemporary Russian interests. To your recollection, was the conceptual frame of Russian colonialism, or more generally decolonization, ever used in the process of making these distinctions? Were such terms, concepts regularly employed among your leftist informants during Euromaidan?
Yes, I will tell you a story from 2012 during my fieldwork that I think about a lot. Coming out of my comprehensive exams and coming into my preliminary fieldwork, I feel like I'm, a real anthropologist now, and I'm very much steeped in the anthropological debate about post-socialism. That's what we're talking about. What does it mean to be post-socialist? And I get to Ukraine and I'm talking to student activists about this question, and one of them says to me, well, Emily, we don't really think of ourselves as part of post-socialism. Like, that concept isn't really that relevant to us. We're thinking about colonialism. We are thinking about how Ukraine is in this colonial relationship to Russia, as well as potentially to the EU. This was really helpful for my framing as I was thinking about how to think about Ukraine at all. And it's not necessarily something that I delve into too much in the book, although I think I probably could have. I was still very much focused on post-socialism because I wanted to be part of the anthropological conversations. But just this framing that, the claims that have previously historically been made on Ukraine from the Russian end are colonial claims, right? That's a colonial claim that the Russian Empire as well as the Soviet Union made on Ukraine. And that the reason that leftists want to distinguish themselves from those Soviet and Russian claims is because they are anti-imperialist actors. That also positions them as not accepting a colonial relationship with Europe, which includes, obviously, Ukrainian historical experiences in which European powers did colonize parts of Ukraine, but it also includes this kind of modern framing of the European Union as a colonial institution, which is definitely something that has been explored in terms of scholarship about the EU. Has not always really effectively been applied in Ukraine, even if it has been thought through really well. But I think it's really interesting that these are people who have been talking about how Ukraine is in these colonial relationships for a very long time. Now that's something that is getting a lot more attention. What I have learned kind of going back to that is that this is actually something that Ukrainians have been thinking about and writing about for a long time. I mean, back into the Soviet period, I've been reading Ivan Zuba. Like that's really there's a real foundation for that. And this is something that, like, in in retrospect, you think about your research. Like, I feel like I missed the chance to go down that road at that point, and almost wish that I had. But it's still, I think it's very striking that people were talking about that framework, even if they weren't necessarily like. I'm trying to remember. I don't think there was ever really talk about that as part of their presence on Maidan. I think that would have been a little bit too provocative. Although in the beginning of the book, the kind of in the introduction, I have this flyer that they handed out that was very critical of hierarchies within the EU, and kind of wanting to position themselves as advocating for Ukraine to find its chance to do it, figure out what it wanted to be, not being under the thumb of any imperial power, whether that's from the European side or from the Russian side. Obviously, the European path was agreed upon to be a more suitable path, especially once it became clear that Ukraine was not going to get to prevent Russia from continuing to make these imperial claims. So, Europe becomes much more desirable when that's the other option. But I think that kind of positioning of themselves in that critical anti-imperial position that included both Russia and Ukraine, or both Russia and Europe, was really, really fascinating at that time. So yeah, thanks for the question.
Okay, thank you so much. I think we have no more questions from the audience, but I wanted to ask just one question for myself. And your work touches a lot on obviously feminism, and I think you have a chapter on gender specifically. And during the time of war, Ukraine is, as a state, is acting in very inconsistent way, in somewhat, in that sense that, for example, it is progressive in that sense. Ukrainian government ratified the Istanbul Convention recently, but also it doesn't let men at the age of 18 to 60 to leave and expect them to serve in the army and take this traditionally masculine role. And do you see that in any way affecting sort of gender roles in the society, in Ukrainian society, how it will be viewed, how it is viewed now, and how it will be viewed in the future?
Yeah, I think this is a really, really important question for someone to do a big research project about, because it combines a couple of really important things. It combines, you're exactly right that there's this inconsistency, because on the one hand, we have female combatants, female volunteers, female medics, and over the past 5 years, this huge and really effective advocacy, legislative change in Ukraine to protect women in their status, to recognize their combatant status and also their veteran status. So on the one hand, we have this really progressive, if we want to, I don't even know if we need to call it that, but this more inclusive legislation that recognizes that the armed forces is not only a masculine thing. But then on the other hand, as you mentioned, we have this martial law that targets specifically men and limits the role of men to this very militarized role, even though there are plenty of men who, don't do other things, who do other kinds of work that's supportive, that doesn't have to be armed forces work. What I am curious about in the long term is what that does to gender roles. When you have, I think one of these things that's going to be key is the role of this unified idea of veterans. Is that something that's going to become this very male-dominated space that fights for very traditionalist ideas about masculinity because of this nature of this rule about what men can and can't do? Will women who are combatants and veterans get marginalized as part of that simply because of this framework that you're talking about? Going back to Maria's question about opening up the space, one thing I have also found really fascinating, though, is that this whole discussion has created the opportunity to advocate for same-sex partnerships, partly because same-sex partners should have veterans' rights and have the same, access if somebody is in the hospital or is injured or something, right? There are like, basically these circumstances are being created where people are more open to the idea of same-sex partnerships than they were before. Is this going to change, the nature of gender roles in Ukrainian society? I think it's really impossible to say. And part of that is also because I do not find it to be especially popular to criticize that martial law. I've heard it a couple of times, but I just don't think a lot of people are taking that stance that it's not acceptable, that the government should be allowing all men to leave. But once it becomes more possible to challenge how that has played out, I very much wonder what will happen. Will women feel pushed back into these support roles that they worked very hard to get out of because male voices are more dominant in a society where you're likely to have over 2 million veterans who are probably going to be like 80% male? I really don't know, but it's a very, very, very important question, and one that is in that space of, do we ask this question now or do we save it for some time later? I mean, I think we should be talking about it now, but I also don't want to position myself as critical of some of these other great things that have happened, like, as you mentioned, the ratification of the Istanbul Convention, this proposal of same-sex partnerships. These are great opportunities that I think hopefully show us a little bit of a change in social opinion as a whole, but it's very hard to say at this point.
Okay. Well, thank you for your answer. And I think we are to questions now, but maybe for the end, I just want to say that while people were registering for the webinar, I was collecting the regions where people are watching it from. And some of them are watching it from Ukraine. And so I was wondering if you have any last message to end this with, either to Ukrainians who are watching it from Ukraine, or maybe even Ukrainians who are watching it from elsewhere. What would be your message before we finish this webinar?
Just such a nice sentiment. I mean, I owe my entire career to people in Ukraine who allowed me to come and ask all these questions and follow them around Maidan and tell me what was happening. I would have nothing if it weren't for them. And now a lot of them are, on the front lines and trying to make sure that we can all go back to Ukraine and live there in peace sometime in the future. So I think mostly thank you. Thanks, to the specific people who I've worked with for your help, but generally, to Ukrainians as a whole for making it possible for me to do what I do. It's really very meaningful to me. And thank you so much for even attending, being interested in this talk. It really means the world.
And thank you for doing what you do too. And thanks for our viewers for attending this, and all the best.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Andrei. Thank you so much for everyone who attended.
Thank you. Bye-bye.